So hi everyone, nice to see you and welcome to this webinar in the SSH Network webinar series. So that's the Social Sciences and Humanities Network related to IPES that I organize with Maria Stenseke and Marla Emery. And so today we have this webinar that we've really been looking forward to with Pamela McElwee from the Rutgers University, titled Governing for Transformative Change Across the Biodiversity, Climate, Society Nexus. So I'll just make a short introduction of the speaker today. So Dr. Pamela McElwee is Professor of Human Ecology at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, USA. McElwee's work focuses on household level impacts and engagement with policies for climate mitigation, ecosystem services valuation, and biodiversity conservation. And she has conducted field work on these issues in Southeast Asia for over the last 25 years, so quite a long period, a lot of experience there. She has also served as lead author for the IPES Global Assessment, as well as the IPCC Special Report on Land. And she was also one of the authors of the recent joint IPCC-IPES workshop report on biodiversity and climate change. So you have experience from both these global environmental assessment institutions, which is really interesting, I think. And Pamela also holds a joint PhD in forestry and anthropology from Yale University. And with that, Pam, I give you the floor.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Let me just share my slides. Wonderful. Great. Well, it's great to be here today to present a little bit of information based on, as Akan said, the recent IPCC-IPBES joint workshop report, which I was part of and which came out in June. And I'm particularly today going to talk a little bit about the last two chapters of that report, which were the social science focused chapters, although they weren't exclusively social science. So chapter 6 of the joint workshop report focused a lot on the idea of there being a biodiversity climate society nexus and what that entails, how we can understand that, particularly through concepts of thresholds and tipping points. And then chapter 7, which is the one that I worked on, particularly focused on the governance aspects of that nexus. You know, if we accept that there are all these interconnections and we understand their dynamics, what are the implications of that for redesigning governance systems, tailoring policies to better account for all three elements of the nexus? So that's a little bit of the background. And what the authors of these two chapters have done since the workshop report came out in June is basically put our efforts together and come up with a overarching article, which is now under review at Bioscience, that basically takes the lessons of both of those chapters and sort of distills them down, particularly for an audience. Bioscience is, I think, often an audience of more natural scientists. And so it's a chance to engage with them, speak to some of the social science issues in this biodiversity climate space that we hope will be really helpful. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a preview of that paper today, noting that I'm only the second author, and so it's Unai Pasquale who is the lead author on this paper, and he said, when I told him I was presenting about this today, he said it sounded like a great opportunity to get some feedback on it, because hopefully we will get the A-OK, but have to do some revisions on this paper in the next couple of months. And so really looking forward to folks' feedback on it. So the paper itself, I'm just going to present a real snapshot of it. But just to say what we did in the paper, we essentially summarized the conceptual points that came out of chapter 6 and 7, and then we added some case studies, which had not actually been that emphasized in the IPCC-IPBES report itself. So the case studies then were developed post-report to sort of apply the principles that we saw coming out of the overall report to some specific empirical examples. And so we used 4 case studies in the paper: forest ecosystems, marine ecosystems, human settlements and urban planning, and then a geographic case study of the Arctic. And in light of time, so we have plenty of time for questions, I'm just going to talk about the forest case study today, but the bigger paper has these 4 case studies. And the case studies are used to highlight some of the key conceptual concepts, as I said, but also provide a chance to present what we think are some key principles deriving from the workshop report. And so those principles, which I'll go into in this presentation, are building multifunctional interventions, making sure they cross those nexus points, facilitating integrated, multi-scalar governance institutions, building coalitions for support across the nexus, ensuring that equity is something that's addressed through all of the nexus, and then facilitating social tipping points. So I'll talk about what all of those things are, but just sort of to give you the conclusion first, that those are the principles we ended up with. So one of the things that the overall workshop report, across all the chapters, not just the social science chapters, really highlighted was that the feedbacks and the interactions among biodiversity, climate, and society happen at multiple spatial, temporal, and organizational scales, but they're not often acknowledged as much as we could. And, I think we can all come up with examples where if you focus just on the climate side of things, you get a very different type of policy or intervention than if you focused on society or biodiversity. But of course, these things are interconnected in real life. And so it's a real problem if we have these siloed approaches. And anytime we have a response strategy that ignores these interactions, it could miscalculate or underestimate risk. And these risks are really highlighted throughout the report. And there's a real danger of biophysical changes that are potentially irreversible when we're talking about biodiversity loss or climate change beyond 1.5 degrees. And so it's that sort of irreversibility of some of the outcomes that lends a real heightened need to acknowledge these risks in our institutional responses. And so we sort of set this up as being a way to start moving towards transformational change. And so, of course, transformational change is sort of the concept of the moment. It's going to be really the focus of the next IPBES assessments. And so our argument is that, to really think about transformational change, part of that has to be thinking about this, what we call the BCS nexus, biodiversity, climate, and society nexus. And hopefully transformational change and a transformational approach to governance can then catalyze and create ways of dealing with the BCS system in ways that I hopefully are going to be transformational. So one of the things that we do in the early part of this condensed report in bioscience, but the chapter 6 and the workshop report really does, is talk about what the nexus is. Where do we see these nexus elements? Where are there trade-offs and synergies across biodiversity, climate, and society? So, if you just focus, say, for example, on biodiversity and climate, you might, for example, miss the societal connections, which very much depend on how those biodiversity and climate interactions occur. So we can think, for example, of the social impacts of biodiversity restoration projects. If those ignore the social dimensions, they might not, for example, focus on species in restoration projects that might have cultural dimensions like wild harvested foods. And so we need to obviously pay attention to that. This is a social science audience. I don't need to to overemphasize that because everybody here knows that, but it's something that really needs to be emphasized for the natural scientists that were a big part of the joint report. And so we sort of talk about what all those elements of the nexus are and give some examples of where, there's an overemphasis on the BC side, that blue arrow, and what happens when you ignore the societal side. We talk a lot in the paper about how society is in turn shaped by what's going on in the BC interaction, that society is not separate from all of this. And essentially discussion of this overall nexus allows us to focus in on some negative examples of where we haven't seen a sufficient acknowledgement of all of those interconnections. And so we give examples of things like anti-poverty interventions that might focus on the society element here might, for example, have a real focus on economic growth or agricultural intensification that might trigger, for example, land grabbing, as we've seen, particularly since the 2005-06 financial crisis. And those sort of land grabbing interactions, of course, then feed back into climate and biodiversity because they may provide a driver of shifts in species, conversion of forests, and so forth. And so there's a lot of examples of what happens if you ignore these potential interactions. And so the workshop report comes up with this figure, and then the chapter 6 really goes into depth talking about where we see these interactions between the BCS space, and essentially dividing them up into some key across 3 different possible outcomes. So co-beneficial, where we have a sort of nice net outcome across biodiversity, climate, and social, where there's net gains across all 3. That's a great goal. Unfortunately, the examples we give in the workshop report basically show that this is unfortunately not as common an outcome as the other 2, which are trade-offs. We obviously know that if you focus on just 1 or 2 elements of the nexus, there might be negative outcomes for other parts of it. And then, of course, there are also outcomes that are net lose, lose, lose across all 3 elements. And so those are obviously ones that we want to avoid as well. And one of the things we emphasize, though, is that it's sometimes hard to do these sorts of simplistic categorizations because there's a lot of complexities that underlie these BCS interactions. And there's particular problems with non-linearities. So, one thing which seems small can then amplify. It can be synergistic. It can have a saturating function. There's cascades. There's feedbacks. There's also the problem of spatially and temporally diffuse effects, or something that happens now. You might actually not actually see the long-term outcome until later. And so this makes it very challenging to be able to see where we get co-benefits, trade-off, and co-detriments in real time. And so we talk in the report in more depth about how can we think about these sort of cascading and synergistic problems within the BCS nexus. And one of the things we draw attention to that we think both natural scientists and social scientists need to pay more attention to is the concept of the speed, the timing in which a lot of these things happen. And so we give some examples of socio-ecological systems that include a mix of processes that are operating at both fast and slow rates. And so we argue that this is one of the things that really needs to be built into our governance systems in ways that is really inadequate right now. And we talk about, examples of fast processes within the social space include things like political electoral cycles. Here in the US, basically political cycles are 2 to 4 years, incredibly slow. We also talk about in the physical space, there's also sort of fast processes such as short-lived climate forcers like methane, or crop production cycles, which tend to be seasonal. And then you have slow processes like those that are associated with long time frames, ice sheet melting, sea level rise, decomposition of soil organic matters, or from the social science side, the slowness by which shifting values often occurs. We have examples of where values, change, but often they're on fairly long time scales, even to the point of generations. And so considering these overlapping fast and slow processes really has a lot of implications for governance, right? It really calls for policy flexibility, sort of continual innovation in social learning, adjustment and adaptation of governance arrangements. And so there's more details about all of that in the longer joint workshop report. And then chapter 6 also has, I think, a really interesting discussion of tipping points that relates both to biophysical and social tipping points. Because I think often tipping points, particularly when the climate space, are thought of more as those biophysical thresholds, a tipping point by which permafrost melting becomes this positive feedback that can sort of amplify itself. But one of the things we talk about in the report is we need our responses and our governance systems to think about tipping points in two ways. One is obviously avoiding those negative tipping points. And we talk about the risks of exceeding biophysical limits and crossing those irreversible thresholds is exceedingly high, calling really for an application of the precautionary principle within the BCS space in ways that typically aren't, it's not really foregrounded. But we also talk about how there can be positive tipping points, and these are primarily coming from the social science space. And so we talk about how social tipping points can be defined in these situations that basically lead to deliberate and desirable social transformations. These tipping points, like biophysical tipping points, are often typically nonlinear, where just a small intervention or a small event can trigger an accelerating feedback response. It often leads to a substantial change. We give some examples of this in the workshop report. There's some good studies of, say, for example, restoration projects where not just the lands that are restored through the intervention often create positive dynamics, but surrounding lands. So restoration can actually set off feedbacks. Nearby landowners can see the benefits of restoration and then want to join in as well. We talk about issues of divestment from fossil fuels as a social tipping point, whereby a few investors might pull out of fossil fuels initially, and then it creates this dynamic by which everyone wants to divest because they would potentially be left having losses if they're the only ones left. So there are these social tipping dynamics that are really worth paying attention to in our governance space. And again, this is going to require a sort of mix of interventions, that are shifting collective norms, since a lot of these are about opinions and values. So they really are linked to behavioral change. And so there's a real need for multiple social science disciplines here: psychology, environmental humanities, the non-economic social sciences that work with values. And so we think there's a real need for a dynamic space here. And we have this little figure in the workshop report and also in the bioscience that thinks about, where, if we think about the sort of ways in which the climate and biodiversity space operate, and in the dynamic, you can see biodiversity's on the left-hand side, climate's on the right-hand side. We want to try to get in this little channel that's in the middle of them. And it's possible to sort of influence those pathways by having those social tipping points. We want to sort of push those operational points into positive social outcomes that cross both biodiversity and climate. And so thinking about what those social tipping points might be is a really important job for social scientists. And so we're sort of issuing a call for more social scientists to help us think through what those positive tipping points might be that allow for a convergence into that zone. And so part of this is thinking about how transformative governance, that is governance that allows for transformative change, can help us do that. So we want to get those social tipping points. We want to get governance systems that are transformative. And so we talk a little bit about this paper that came out of the global assessment, which is lead author of Ingrid Visser and Hammacher's, where transformative governance is really defined as being something that's integrative, it's equitable, it's adaptive, and it really engages with discussions of, what are desirable futures, how are social values going to be connected to those, whether or not transformation is actually desirable. Some people may resist transformative change, so we need to acknowledge that. And then who's included? Who are making these decisions about transformation? And so all of this is really important in the BCS space in particular, because we know that some sectors have outsized voices, particularly, say, for example, fossil fuel interests. And so the resistance to transformative change is oftentimes just as important to pay attention to as the support for it. And the implications for this, for the particular BCS space, is that we need to really think about how our policies are facilitating transformative governance, where they're falling down, and whether or not our approaches are also creating those spaces for social tipping points. So we take these 4 case studies, as I mentioned. I'll just talk about the forest one. And we discuss in this case study where approaches to governance are not being transformative. This is a sort of negative case study, being insufficiently transformative and insufficiently attuned to those social tipping points. And I think RED, reduced emissions from degradation and deforestation, is a great example of where our policies really fall short. Because on the surface, RED is really supposed to be this opportunity to embrace climate, biodiversity, and society together. All of the literature on RED talks about how there's an attempt to design a triple win situation. We're going to pay communities and households, they're going to get social benefits, we're going to get climate benefits, and we'll hopefully get biodiversity co-benefits. But if you actually drill down into the RED literature, as many of the attendees probably know, it really has become very siloed. So there's some RED approaches that are very focused on social benefits, demarcating land tenure rights, providing economic benefits, but the biodiversity benefits, for example, are not very well established or quantified or obtained. There's other cases where there's been a real focus on carbon, but very little social benefit. So there's very siloed approaches. So even where we have good intentions, we don't always achieve that nexus. We also argue that one of the problems with RED and any other type of offset mechanism is they don't really fulfill our goal of being adaptive. And they're often unable to respond quickly enough to ecosystem state changes. And this is due both to the complexity of monitoring and the need for results-based payments. And these operate a little too slowly. They don't have a nimbleness to them. And we saw a great example of that this summer in the United States. We had a lot of wildfires in the western part of the US, and some of the forests that were very dramatically impacted were forests that were in the California offset market. And there was no mechanism to deal with the fact that these offset forests that had been purchased primarily by the emissions reductions had been purchased by fossil fuel companies. There was no way to sort of quickly require those fossil fuel companies to shift to some other, emissions reduction of their own operations to account for the carbon that had gone up in the air during these wildfires and the loss of the longer term sink capacity. So there just wasn't a sort of nimbleness to the offset market. And we argue that it's unlikely that RED is going to meet our demands for transformative change, particularly if RED is in these overall carbon markets, because it's likely that the things that would be required to make RED truly crossing the nexus, that is to have really robust biodiversity mechanisms and really robust social equity mechanisms, is going to make RED more expensive. So RED that achieves BCS goals is going to be pricier. And if we have a bunch of companies in the market that are looking for basically the cheapest prices, that the red approaches that we think are best for the BCS are likely to just suffer in those markets. And I don't see, even with the attention to the Task Force on Voluntary Carbon Markets and their attention to high quality to them does not mean good for biodiversity and society. It means high quality for carbon. So there's a real problem here. And then, of course, there's the danger of red creating perverse incentives for fossil fuel reduction, sort of delaying inaction, leading to policy lock-in. And this, we've got all sorts of evidence from the red literature about things like systematic overcrediting, the markets being slow to challenge to respond to feedback loops. The markets don't price in disturbance risks like wildfires. So it's not going to meet our goals for being really adaptive. It also doesn't deal particularly well with the demands. The reason why we have forest loss in the first place is because we have demands for timber and other commodities that are planted on forest lands. And there's no built-in mechanism to try to use, for example, a social tipping point. Like, how can we reduce demand for certain forest-based commodities through social tipping mechanisms? Red doesn't deal particularly well with demand. And so that's another reason why we think it's unlikely to take us where we need to go. So to sort of conclude with what the paper concludes with is that we, through these case studies, some of which are more negative, like the forest one, some of which are more positive. We have a case study of the Arctic where governance mechanisms, we argue, actually are doing a pretty good job across the BCS nexus. They're fairly responsive. They deal with values. They have sort of built-in ways to deal with feedback loops. Derived from those case studies, we talk about 5 principles that sort of meet our needs for this transformative governance. And so we talk about, across the BCS nexus, we need multifunctional interventions, no single bullets. And when we talk about maximizing performance on single indicators like carbon or so forth, we run the risk of not paying attention to how co-benefits can be built. One of the principles is thinking about integrated multi-scalar governance institutions and what those look like. And this is where we have to really engage with the social science community to help think those through. We talk about building up coalitions of support, and this is where the social tipping mechanisms become really important. So we want to tip, for example, those powerful private sector interests. How can we tip those towards sustainability? That could involve, say, strengthening coalition of interests that are advocating for reform, such as subsidy reform, and so forth, making sure there's local priorities in those political coalitions. Making sure that we have ambitions and outcomes that are matched to equity. And so we give a few examples of some programs that have equity as a sort of key focus of governance approaches. And then finally, we think about, what are the conditions that we can sort of pay attention to in terms of the social tipping points. And, that's where the social scientists can help us see, where have there been social tipping points in the last decade or so. And so one example we give here is the rapid uptake of electric vehicles in a few countries that sort of exceeded projections. And so there's clearly something going on there that social scientists need to help us understand. The youth school strike for climate is another example, right? That these have really taken on a life of their own, and so we need to help understand. They're very hard to predict, and once they get going, they can grow large very quickly. But are there conditions that we can understand these and build them, sort of create social tipping points, rather than sort of waiting for them to happen? So that's the overall approach the paper takes. I'll stop sharing my screen at this point, and would really look forward to there we go. People's comments on some of the things that we're talking about. I'm sorry, I didn't go into a lot of detail because I wanted to give the overarching approaches here and sort of flag where social science is going to be really important to the, this report going forward, even though social science was sort of in those last two chapters, the sort of mission of those chapters sort of launching us forward towards the next transformative change assessment and new publications, across the board. That's what we hope to highlight with this report.
Thank you so much, Pam, for this this really interesting presentation. And I also really appreciate you pointing out these issues that social scientists and humanities scholars need to look more into.